Let me introduce Michael Hanlon, who's a senior fellow at Brookings in foreign policy. For those of you news junkies out there, you have read Mike's work, many op-eds in all the leading national papers. You've seen him on all the talk shows. He's a go-to guy for information on foreign policy, U.S. military policy. He's just published a book on nuclear policy. Tonight he's talking to us on his other specialty, which is the Afghan situation. Mike?
Thanks, everyone. It's a real treat to be back. We had a lot of fun here with the Brookings Opportunity 08 project that we did in conjunction with UNLV and also a few other universities around the country back in 07. So the last time I was here, I was watching Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama show tough body language towards each other as we got ready for the November 07 debate. But it's a lot of fun to be here now, 3 years later already, talking about an issue that unfortunately won't go away, even though the campaign of 2008 finally did, and that's the Afghanistan war. And really what I want to do, because it's a topic that we've all had to live with for a decade now, it's our nation's longest war ever, and it's only intensified, obviously, in recent months. I don't want to give you a long song and dance or comprehensive primer on the country or anything. I want to cut right to an argument that I think is a little counterintuitive or contrarian for much of what we've been hearing in the news, although I'm not going to overdo it, and I don't want to sound too much in the direction that I'm going to try to lead the conversation, and then look forward to a discussion, which I think will be more fun than just listening to me. But what I really want to do is, to some extent, make the case for hope. And this is not an unbridled, rah-rah speech about how if we just stand behind General Petraeus, he'll do it again no matter what, nor is it sort of a wrap myself in the flag the day before Veterans Day, and if you just let the men and women of America's military on a problem, they will ultimately prevail. I'm not going to go to those extremes because I think there are ways we could still lose this war. And I think, frankly, we're not yet winning it. And I don't think we're losing at the moment, but on the other hand, the more time that goes by without clear positive momentum, that begins to feel like a loss and begins to run the risk of being a loss as the American political system gets tired of putting $100 billion a year and several hundred American lives into an effort for no apparent purpose. So I do think we're at a crucial moment, and I'm not going to try to overstate the case for optimism. But I do think that it's worth balancing much of what we've generally heard in the American media and elsewhere in the last couple of years about the war, because I think it's been almost all negative, and I think that's not quite right either. And there really is a reason to keep some hopefulness going as we look ahead. You know the sort of the caricature or the summary of the media accounts of the war. It's pretty straightforward. We've lost more people every year than we had the year before. Unfortunately, that's true. These media accounts are not wrong. They're just incomplete. So one thing we hear is the violence is going up every year. Unfortunately, that's true. Something else we hear is that Pakistan continues to be a sanctuary where the Afghan insurgents can retreat and regroup after they do attacks against us over the border. That also is true. We hear that President Karzai's inner circle is corrupt, almost beyond belief, and to the point where it's understandable why many Afghans would not really be supporting him and maybe even be tempted to support the insurgency. Unfortunately, that also is true. In September, in the parliamentary elections, and I had the great honor of being there and being one of the election observers for one of the NGOs that was there watching them, we heard about allegations of people buying votes. We've seen a lot of discussion of how there was fraud, how a lot of votes have been thrown out, a lot of candidates were trying to cheat. All that's true as well. So how can I possibly be here with any kind of plausible case for optimism? Let me begin with just some of the assets we really have in this conflict that some of you probably are aware of, and when you think about it, it's not too surprising that we have these assets, but others of them you may have lost track of or just not heard as much about because the media accounts have been largely negative. And since we're in a school of journalism, let me begin, before I even get through that list of our assets and strengths, with sort of a fairly straightforward observation about the nature of media in a democratic society, which I think is worth bearing in mind as we get these negative accounts. And if there are journalists in the room and you want to quibble with this assessment later on after I finish, please feel free. But I think I'm saying something that's not uncomplimentary to the media and is basically correct, but still puts some of the media reports, the negative media reports, in perspective. The media have two roles in a Western democracy, and they're different. One role is to report the news. And when you think about the media, that's sort of what you think of as the most obvious role. But the other role is to be the fourth estate, to be a check on government, to hold government accountable, including our own government, when it's asking Americans to spend $100 billion a year and risk their sons and daughters on a foreign war. In an era when many of the journalists who still are around today either sharpened their teeth or at least read history books when they were kids about the recent Vietnam War and don't want to go down that path again, no more than President Obama wants to go down that path again. And they seem to see some similarities between Afghanistan and Vietnam. And I think there are some, by the way. And I'm not going to stand here tonight before you and pretend otherwise. But because the media has this role of being a critic of government and a fourth estate, an independent voice, which in some ways is designed or sees itself as being properly designed to hold government accountable, the media has a natural tendency in this kind of a situation to emphasize the bad news. Now that's fine to an extent, but it also runs the risk of skewing the perception of how the war is going. And let's also remember that many of our media friends, and there are many who are very brave and live in these battlefields and stay in Afghanistan, for example, for many years on end. They are probably very good on Afghanistan. They know a lot about it. But they're also potentially influenced by two somewhat distorting realities. One, a lot of them were there back in 03, 04, 05, 06 when life in Afghanistan was a lot easier for them. As a foreigner, it was much easier to be in Afghanistan 5 years ago than it is now. Much less threat of kidnapping, much less threat of assassination, much better life. Doesn't mean life was better for the average Afghan, but it was better for the average Westerner. And the overall levels of violence were less in general. And therefore, people compare today to what they remember from back then, and that creates a negative perception, a negative bias within the perception or mindset of the reporter. And a second point to bear in mind, and here this varies from person to person, but there are a number of reporters in Afghanistan who are not really experts in developing countries and how their democracies evolve, how their anti-corruption efforts evolve. So just like any of us, they have some things they're better at than others. Many of them are seasoned war reporters who might have been in Lebanon and Iraq and elsewhere, so they know war. They may or may not understand the nature of a gradually evolving democracy. And so, for example, when you see all these negative reports about the Afghan parliamentary elections in September, a person who was a student of young democracies would say, I see all these similarities between Afghanistan and, Georgia, or Estonia, or Albania, or whatever. Other places that frankly have all, their fair share of problems too. But if you're thinking instead in terms of comparing the Afghan democracy to what democracy should be in its ideal form, it doesn't look very good. So depending on your frame of reference, what you just witnessed, for example, in September, can look okay or bad. And we have to bear in mind that people in the media may or may not be thinking in those terms. Now, some of them are very sophisticated, very good. I'm just trying to make some observations that we don't always think about. Okay, let me get on with my main argument. What is the case for hope? Having now spent 10 minutes clearing my throat and warming up and avoiding the question, let me say a few things. And they're not in any particular order, but we do know, I'll try to put them in three categories, because we do know that when you deal with a counterinsurgency or a nation-building effort, and let's face it, this is nation building. We don't like to use that term, but that's what we're trying to do at some level. You tend to think in terms of economics, in terms of security, and in terms of governance/public opinion. Those are the three main areas of effort where you'd like to see progress. Generally speaking, if you can make progress in all three, you're in pretty good shape. If you make progress in 2 out of 3, maybe you have a chance. In any event, it's a nice way to begin to organize all the different things you have to do and all the different indicators you have to track to know how well you're succeeding or failing in this kind of a conflict. So let me start with the economy. Here, unlike in Iraq, where we actually made things worse by our invasion, and where for 4 or 5 years the Iraqi economy went nowhere. If anything, it went to some extent in a negative direction. In Afghanistan, since the overthrow of the Taliban in 2001, life has definitely gotten better for the average Afghan, measured by GDP, measured by access to education or health care, measured by access to cell phones, just the bustle of life in the Afghan cities, the amount of electricity that's available for people to use. Kabul used to be dark. Now it's a humming place by developing world standards. And frankly, Kabul itself, if you fly in there, which you can do on a commercial airliner, looks pretty good. Kids are not cowering behind their doors. You know, parents are not shooing their families into safety away from the bullets and the car bombs. Kabul today is a far cry from what Baghdad was, for example, in 04, 05, 06, 07 in Iraq. Much better. And the area around Kabul is becoming safer. Did you know that, for example, Kabul has not had a major car bombing since May? Now, maybe I'm damning with faint praise. And you might say, well, comparing today's Afghanistan to the economy of the Taliban and saying that it's better today is no great shakes. And I acknowledge all that. And you might also point out that Afghanistan's economy today is artificially stimulated by those two great artificial stimulants of foreign aid and opium. And the two of them account for a good share of the economic progress. And that's not very sustainable or strong of a foundation on which to build an economy. And I would have to cry uncle on all those points, all those critiques. But the fact does remain that the economy's been getting better. Most people are living better. Schools are open. 2.5 million girls are in school. I'm sure you've heard people cite these statistics before, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't prove we're going to succeed, but it does give you some reason to think that the Afghan people want it to succeed. And that's sort of my main point here. So if we're wondering fundamentally whether we are doing something that the Afghan culture and Afghan population reject or accept, that's a pretty easy call. They accept it. They want it too. They want this new world. They don't want to go back to the 15th century. They don't want to go back to the Taliban. And they may be mad as heck at Karzai, but the reason they're mad at him is because the system that he is running is actually skewing the distribution of resources and benefiting some tribes and people more than others, not helping others as much as it should. But the general notion of the tide rising and Afghanistan entering the 21st century is something that Afghans very much want. If that weren't the case, you wouldn't see 8 million cell phones in use, for example. And you wouldn't see people clamoring to get into higher institutes of learning and so forth. You wouldn't see the cosmopolitan areas growing in size and activity. So all these things are happening, and the notion or the caricature of the Afghan people as hating foreigners, rejecting the modern world, and just wanting to be left alone is mostly wrong, I would argue. Now, admittedly, there is a rural-urban divide in Afghanistan, and there is a divide between more traditional attitudes and more modern ones. And I would acknowledge that the more traditional rural society is a little more ambivalent and a little more nervous about some of the things that are happening. But it's hardly the case that people want to go back in time. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at any poll that's been done. And you probably should have some doubt about those polls. All polls should be taken with a grain of salt, and maybe even more so in a war zone. But let me point out that some of the things you see in those polls make sense and sort of validate the idea that Afghans do honestly answer questions posed to them. For example, in 2002, when people asked Afghans, how do you feel about NATO? How do you feel about the United States? How do you feel about President Karzai? And this was a year after the Taliban had been overthrown. This was when electricity was getting turned back on. The world looked promising. There was no violence to speak of politically. And 85% of Afghans said, yeah, we like him. And then each year after that, as things got worse, or as we failed to improve life very much, the popularity of the United States and NATO declined, the popularity of Karzai declined, and it all sort of made sense. Then when Obama got elected, actually even a little bit before President Obama was elected, as George Bush started to turn his attention more towards Afghanistan, as the surge in Iraq wound down, Afghans started to get a little more positive because they saw a little more effort, a little more energy. So in other words, I'm just trying to say the polls sort of make sense in Afghanistan, and they do tend, therefore, to me to be a useful source of information or validation of things you can learn in other ways as well. So the overall economy is getting better. Kabul, as the capital city, is doing better all the time. The number of major attacks there is low. The growth of what General Petraeus calls the security bubble around Kabul is continuing. And by the way, most of Kabul, and this gets into the security indicators, which I'll talk about more in a second, most of Kabul is actually secured by Afghans. Now, sure, we have a NATO headquarters there. We have a bunch of NATO headquarters there, but they are headquarters there, they are located there because of that ability to then interact with the Afghan government. They are not there to deploy combat forces or police on the streets of the capital. That's being done primarily by Afghans, and relatively successfully. So again, you have the notion that this country has proven that there are certain cities, certain places it can protect, it can make work, it can, turn into a little bit of a forward light or beacon of hopefulness about the future. So that's the economy. Now let me talk a little bit more about the Afghan people. And I mentioned these public opinion surveys a few minutes ago, and I want to say a few more things about the Afghan people that you may or may not know. Some of you may not agree with everything I'm going to say. I'm not suggesting that you can easily generalize across all Afghans, and I certainly know some Afghans who would agree with some of what I'm about to say more than other Afghans. But these general realities, I think, are fair to at least put out as approximations to general Afghan thinking. First of all, they don't want the Taliban back. That's just pretty compelling and pretty overwhelmingly obvious from virtually any poll. Now, yes, if you ask them, would you favor peace talks with the Taliban at this point, they tend to say yes to that also. But what they are realizing is that this war has gone on too long, and that maybe some kind of a traditional Afghan-style shura or compromise of some kind can protect most of what they want by way of a modern way of life and a democracy, but allow the Taliban a little bit of a seat at the table, and if that brings an end to the violence, then that's fine. That's what I think they're saying when they support the peace talks. Because anytime you ask them, do you like the Taliban? Do you want to live under the Taliban? Do you have any sympathy for the ideology of the Taliban? The answers are always no. And if, the favorability of the Taliban is usually between 5 and 10%. And again, look at any poll you want, and you might say, well, yeah, but the government is the one asking these questions, or at least the Afghans might interpret the person coming to you. If it's you, sir, and you're a pollster and you come to me and I'm a villager in Afghanistan, I assume that you're maybe sent by the government or by NATO, so I better give you the answer you want or I'm in trouble. Well, if you were concerned about that potential bias in the surveys, then presumably these same people would be saying we love NATO and we love the Afghan government. But in reality, their message about NATO and the Afghan government, as I just mentioned, has become much more complicated. For example, our popularity now is only around 40%. It's rebounded a little, as I mentioned, in the last 2 years, but it's still not good. So they're willing to say, we don't really like NATO that well compared to our expectations, compared to what we thought NATO could do, should do for us. And so again, that gives some legitimacy and some believability to these surveys. Something else they say, when you ask them, do you think President Karzai and his cronies cheated on the election last year? They say yes. They don't feel the need to deny that. When they're asked then, do you feel that, that Karzai ultimately got into that position by a lot of unsavory methods and a lot of shenanigans and probably an inflated vote count? They say yes, he did. But then if you ask, do you like Karzai? They also say yes. So what they're saying is this corrupt politician, they know to be corrupt, and yet they think he's better than any alternative that they have seen on the horizon so far. And that sort of makes sense. And we sort of understand that dynamic in American politics, right? I mean, how many times do you vote for the least bad bum as opposed to the person you really love, at least in sort of the popular mind? And we've certainly had parts of our country like, Chicago and New York and Massachusetts historically that had periods when the bosses of the town were known to be corrupt and ran mafia-like organizations or warlord-like organizations, but were still accepted as the least bad thing. That's sort of what Afghans are saying. So again, I believe these surveys, because when you add up what they're telling you, there doesn't seem to be an intimidation factor. There seems to be a directness. And the same people who will say Karzai's associates are corrupt will also say, yeah, but he's probably about as good as we're going to get. and I can't think of anybody better. Something else from the surveys that's even more encouraging than that tepid assessment of their president is how they feel about themselves as Afghans. And a lot of people will say, oh, that's not a country, it's just a bunch of tribes, Afghanistan. And they're tribes that are traditionalist, and they don't really want to be part of the 20th or 21st centuries. And so we shouldn't try to make a country out of them. Well, in addition to ignoring 20th century Afghan history, which basically was caricatured or characterized by a central government that did work at some level until the world came in and destroyed that government. We, the outside world, destroyed Afghanistan. It wasn't that they never had a government and that somehow we try to impose it. They had a weak but still real central government for much of the 20th century. Then the Soviets invaded. Then the Pakistanis, Americans, and Saudis mounted a mujahideen resistance to defeat the Soviets. Then we abandoned the mujahideen and the country after the Soviets left. And now we say, well, all Afghans want to do is operate in these old-fashioned tribal structures. Well, we're the ones that collectively destroyed what they had as an alternative to that. And yes, they do still care about their tribes, but if you ask them, who are you? Who are you first and foremost? They say, Afghan. And then they say, maybe after that, Tajik or Pashtun or Hazara or Uzbek. And then maybe after that, what tribe they're from. But there is a sense of national identity. Now, does that mean that a civil war is impossible? Does that mean the country will definitely hold together no matter what? No. There are tensions, there are jealousies, there are rivalries, but it's not like Iraq or Bosnia or Rwanda, where you had a level of ethnic hatred and distrust that made people almost itching for ethnic violence. It's not like that. They're 9 years into this war with our presence. They're 30 years into a war that began with the Soviet invasion in '79, and yet there really is still not large-scale ethnic violence, even after all that. So there is a sense of national identity, which again is an asset for us to build upon. So I'm going through some of these assets. Now, admittedly, if the best I can do after 9 years of war or nation building or whatever is to quote for you a bunch of statistics that suggest the Afghan people would like to operate as a nation, but I can't actually prove to you that they are functioning very effectively as a nation, again, that's sort of pretty faint praise, and it's pretty worrisome that I have to revert to this kind of public opinion data to provide a hopeful vision of where the country might go. But it does tell you, nonetheless, that they really still want it to work. And I think that's pretty important. But don't worry, my last category of information is a little more concrete. And it's not just about, nice liberal visions of how the country should work. It's about how it actually is working, and specifically in regard to the security forces. Now, some of you may be wondering how I can defend the Afghan security forces, especially the police, which really do have a lot of problems with corruption, with drug use, with some turncoats who are still parts of the insurgency, who sometimes kill our soldiers and have had terrible tragedies in the last year or two along those lines, including recently. And it's very true that the Afghan police have a long ways to go. But let me give you a little bit of a sense. And I've been trying to test this in my various trips, and I ask a lot of questions, and I talk to a lot of people, and I can't prove to you from anything I've learned that it will definitely work to build an Afghan army and police, but there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. One set of reasons has to do with how much General McChrystal and General Petraeus have intensified our effort to build these forces and train them properly. So back, for those of you who know this war and have followed this history, back in 04, 05, 06, we had the attitude of, first of all, don't build them a very big army or police because they can't afford it. We don't want to spend a lot of time building it. We're not going to stay here long enough to really make it work. They don't really want a central police or army anyway. It's a weak collection of tribes, the whole caricature that I was just trying to debunk. And that was sort of the image. And also, of course, the Bush administration did not want to put a lot of resources into Afghanistan because it had other priorities. And frankly, in fairness to Bush, the NATO alliance didn't want to do it either. Even the NATO allies that were not part of the Iraq mission did not really want to do very much in Afghanistan themselves. And we were all hoping that we could sort of help Karzai co-opt most of the warlords into a very loose, federation of quasi-legitimate local structures and have only a very weak army and police. So what happened in that time period, and I am not exaggerating, is that most police got zero training before being given uniforms and weapons and put on the street. Zero training. The majority of Afghan police through 2007 got no training at all. The Army got a little bit of training, and depending on the period, it ranged from 2 to 6 to 8 weeks. But first of all, it was very basic stuff. They didn't try to develop non-commissioned officers. They didn't try to develop specialists in artillery. They didn't try to have effective leadership courses for most of the commanders in the field. And also, once the individual soldiers were graduated and then sort of thrust together into units that barely had any identity or any additional training, they went out to the field by themselves, and we wished them good luck and said, we'll see you sometime. Our job is not really to work with you. Wherever you're trying to stabilize things, I hope you do well. We're going to be somewhere else. We'll be somewhere else chasing down Al-Qaeda or something like that, because a lot of our early effort was designed as a continuation of the anti-terrorism effort as opposed to working with the Afghan police and the Army. And in that time period, the Taliban had not really mounted much of a comeback through about 2005, 2006, so we thought we were getting away with this very minimalist approach. Well, what's happened since with McChrystal and Petraeus is that, first of all, we now do have courses for non-commissioned officers for artillery. We work with the military academies in Afghanistan and make sure that when they graduate officers, those officers go out into the field instead of just straight to the cushy desk jobs in Kabul, which was the previous practice. We try to build an ethnically balanced force, so there's an equal representation or proportionate representation of all the different ethnic groups. We now give them literacy training, which may sound like a detail or a luxury, and General Caldwell, who's in charge of the training mission, in a recent assessment of his first year there, said, when I got here, I didn't really care much about literacy myself. Then I realized, especially for the police, if you can't read, how do you know which car that's parked on the street, might have a car bomb? How do you call in the identity of that car to your higher headquarters to tell them to check their records for the license plate to know who owns that car? Or how do you check your own weapon to make sure that you haven't lost it or you're not taking your buddy's weapon? If we're trying to keep track of weapons, we better let people learn how to read serial numbers. Or countless other little things like that. If there are two people that say they own the same house, and you as the police officer have to read the deed to try to figure out who's right. Now, admittedly, if there's a real dispute, it has to go to a court. But in the near term, just to maintain some law and order, it would help if you could adjudicate in a preliminary way this dispute. The police couldn't do that before. Now we're training 25,000 Afghan Army and police at a time in literacy. But best of all, once we finish these basic individual courses and then basic unit courses, when we send the Afghan Army and police out to the field, we go with them. And this was not done before. So we do now what's called intensive partnering. It's even better than sending a few advisors along with the unit. We try to marry up an Afghan unit with a sister unit from NATO and have them deploy in the field together. Ideally, they live close to each other. Their officers do planning together each day or each week. They go out on joint patrol together. And think of all the benefits of this. For one thing, we can continue to mentor them in the field. Secondly, these Afghan troops that previously had no ability to call in air power or reinforcements if they got ambushed, now have NATO troops by their side, giving them not only the power of NATO soldiers, but the ability to call in help very quickly, which we have and they didn't. Third, think of the anti-corruption benefit of being on patrol every day with an Afghan unit and watching how its commander performs. If you're worried about the corruption of the force, what better way to assess the performance and the competence and the integrity of the leader than to be working with him every day and talking to the same Afghan citizens on the street who have to encounter him and deal with his units. So if you're worried about corruption in Afghanistan and fighting corruption, and you should be, then being out there on patrol each day with these Afghan units is an extraordinary advantage that we never gave ourselves previously. So I could go on, but let me just say one more thing on the progress of the Afghan Army and police beyond the fact that they're growing fast in numbers. That's no big accomplishment because you can give a lot of people a weapon and a paycheck. By the way, the paychecks are now competitive with the Taliban, you'll be glad to hear, if you didn't already know that. And so that was one more reform that we instituted. You know, I'm not trying to criticize Secretary Rumsfeld on this point, because I think a lot of people actually agreed with him in 04, 05, 06, and before, that a minimalist approach to Afghanistan was the right way to go for such a faraway land with such a weak tradition of central government. And a lot of people bought into that. But one of the things Rumsfeld and President Bush thought was, let's not try to build a big army or police, and let's not pay them very well, because ultimately we're going to leave, and the Afghan government, which has virtually no resources, is going to be stuck with paying the bill. And if we build them an army and a police that's too big, they won't be able to afford it. So as far as it went, that logic was fine. But the problem is, well, if the army and police are too small and too underpaid to be effective, then what are your options? What are the other possibilities? You lose the war, or NATO has to do the fighting for them. Either of those options is far more expensive, one way or another, than just properly paying these people, even if we have to do it for the next 20 years. So, you know, let's try to stop spending $100 billion on our own military operations there, even if we have to spend $5 billion a year on their army and police. That's essentially the change in attitude that we've gone through in the last couple of years on this. Seems very obvious and very logical, but it took us 7 or 8 years to get to that point, and that's where we are now. But one more thing I should say is that the Afghan Army and police, because of this partnering, we now have the ability of NATO commanders to assess the performance of these units in the field, and they've worked very hard in 2010 to come up with a scoring system that they think withstands serious scrutiny and incorporates not just basic training and basic equipment, but the bravery, the commitment, the loyalty of these people in the field, the competence they display, their battle toughness. And by these metrics, the Afghan Army is sort of inching over essentially the 50% mark in terms of having units that are either at the A, B, or C level of competence. And so I'm speaking sort of generally and loosely, but it's a 5-point scale, actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we now are at the point where about half of the Afghan Army units are at least scoring a 3 or better. Now, this is subjective to some extent. It's not that scientific. We have some benchmarks we give NATO commanders as they try to do this scoring. It's not perfect, but it still is a lot better of a score than what they were getting a year ago, even as we've now increased the size of the Army and police by about 75,000 over that last year. So all these things are far more encouraging. Do they prove that it's going to work? No. So let me finish on the following point. I think that 2011 is the year we should know if the strategy is basically working. Because in 2011, what we should see is a reduction in violence nationwide. The reason is, in 2009 and 10 and 2008, we added forces to all these different places. When you add forces to areas that had not previously had much NATO presence, you're going to see more fighting, as NATO tries to, along with Afghan Army and police, stabilize these areas, drive out the insurgents. If the strategy works, if the strategy makes intuitive sense, most Afghans should welcome the presence of NATO and the Afghan government in these places that have now been cleared, and be willing over time to increasingly cooperate with us in identifying the identities and the whereabouts of the remaining extremists, and not committing acts of violence themselves against our soldiers or Afghan police. There's no guarantee of that, but if the strategy makes sense and the Afghan people really want this whole thing to work, that's what you should start to see. You are not going to see that this year, because this year, and even still today, we are clearing areas that had previously been occupied and dominated by extremists. So that act of going into new areas leads to more contact with the enemy and more violence. But in 2011, we are not supposed to be going into a lot more new areas. The full complement of troops will have already been in country for 6 to 9 months. We will primarily be stabilizing the areas that we're already present in. Sure, we're still going to do offensive operations. Sure, we're still going to try to move into a few new areas. But for the most part, we will be basically where we intend to be and trying to make the whole thing coalesce. So 2011, you should start to see reduction in violence. How much? I don't know. And I could imagine a very vigorous debate over how much reduction in violence would be necessary to prove that the strategy really is working. And it's going to be tough because the sanctuaries in Afghanistan or in Pakistan are still there. The Karzai government still has big problems with corruption. But that's the real test. And I think there's a good chance that it will work. one very final thought, and I'll stop and look forward to your reactions, is don't think of Afghanistan just as Karzai. Remember all the public opinion surveys that I was quoting for you. Remember the Afghans that you may know. Remember or at least I remember my co-author, Hasina Sherjan, who I wrote this book with, who's an amazing, brave Afghan woman who's built a business and run a girls' school in Afghanistan over the last 8 or 9 years. And she typifies a large group of Afghan reformers, many of them in government, many of them in private sector jobs, who are trying to build their country and don't have the proclivity towards corruption that Mr. Karzai's brothers seem to display with regrettable abundance. And so think of the Afghan people as largely these reformists in the various key ministries of defense and interior and finance and education and rural development, some of the key governors in many of the country's 34 provinces. We're starting to see an improving class of people. And this is something that I, again, have to report to you anecdotally. This is what I hear from my NATO friends when I go over there. And I see some of the evidence myself directly. But we're seeing the Afghan government's overall quality gradually improve, even though the Karzai inner circle is still hugely problematic. And that doesn't mean they're going to win. The Karzai inner circle is still a big problem. The sanctuaries in Pakistan are still a big problem. The level of violence and the strength of the insurgency are big problems. But I hope I've at least given you a little bit of reason to balance all those reasons for worry against some of the more positive things that we've got in our quiver. And I haven't even talked a whole lot about Petraeus and our great troops, which are obviously major advantages we have as well. So why don't I leave it at that? And I hope I've just provoked some discussion. Let's go at it. Ma'am.
Education and economic support, diplomatic efforts, what is enhancing the military presence?
Well, the problem with this, I mean, what I'm tempted to do is to just quote at you some more statistics. And I already did that. I already said there are 2.5 million girls in school, and there's a total of 7 million kids. Under the Taliban, it was less than 1 million, and they were all boys. You know, we're starting to see a recovery of some of the Afghan universities, and the military academy is better. And, you know, I could throw those kinds of numbers at you, and that's all hopeful. But unfortunately, the downside to all this stuff we're trying to do, which Craig Mortensen does not share because he does it a little bit better than we do, frankly, as a government, in his 3 cups of tea approach or stones into schools approach. We do it with a lot of money, a lot of contractors, a lot of, you know, and I'll admit, I respect the Americans who are over there, and if they make halfway decent money doing their jobs, more power to them. If I was doing it over there, I'd expect to make a little bit of a premium myself. But the problem is that pumping all this money into Afghanistan, even though you can look to improvements in the number of schools, number of textbooks, it also feeds the culture of corruption. Because unfortunately what we're doing is we're favoring certain tribes, certain key players, the Karzai inner circle, even as we try to change that way of doing business. So we're doing a lot of what you talk about. And Afghanistan has now become, I think, our most expensive foreign aid program anywhere in the world. It's about $4 billion a year in American money. Not the money I've already mentioned, not the $100 billion a year in our troop costs, not the $6 to $10 billion a year that we pay for the Afghan Army. I'm talking about $4 billion additional in foreign aid for development. So we're trying, and there's no shortage of effort. Unfortunately, the problem is we could still fail because this is all working through a system that's not very efficient and that actually makes a lot of Afghans angry because it, again, depends on paying high salaries and high wages to certain groups and making others, therefore, jealous. So it's mostly a good story about effort and input, but it's not yet clear it's going to be a good story about output and results. Yes, sir.
Could you back up a bit and talk about, I guess one way to put it is the arguments against Biden's more limited effort. I've worked in developing countries for many, many years, and the complexity of social change in those countries boggles my mind.
Right.
And often the military doesn't necessarily, as you've already said, get it. Isn't there a strong argument in favor of the Biden approach, given the complexity of what we're trying to do, and in the context of the Pakistan-India conflict? I mean, do you really feel there's a compelling argument for why we're there, why we're doing what we're doing?
Well, Mike, couple of things. Thank you for a good question. First of all, I would acknowledge the point you made, and I like your point better than I like Vice President Biden's main points, because one of the points you made was it's hard to really reform the whole culture and the whole economy in a short time. And I don't think we have to be successful. I think we do have to try to improve the quality of life, because that shows Afghans that there is something about this new future that's worth building. But we don't have to necessarily, accomplish a given objective on the economic or cultural or social front before we can start to downsize our troops. That can be more of a long-term objective. And so I think what the security forces, we do need to improve the Afghan security forces enough that as we start downsizing, they can hold on to the areas that previously were stabilized by NATO forces. If we can't do that, then we're in trouble. But a lot of the longer-term economic and development activities can continue even after we've downsized. And so I would acknowledge we don't have to fundamentally remake Afghanistan to be at least partially successful. But my problem with the Biden plan is that, and for those of you who haven't been following this in as much detail, he felt that we were doing so much with drones, with commandos, with special forces, that we could be effective against al-Qaeda and extremists with that approach and not try to do counterinsurgency in the South, not try to patrol the streets of Kandahar, et cetera. And admittedly, patrolling the streets of Kandahar is pretty darn hard, and it hasn't yet really turned the corner for us in terms of being obviously achievable. But the problem with doing counterterrorism from long distance, and I've done a fair amount of work on this and discussion with my colleague Bruce Rydell, who's a former CIA guy. I spent a lot of time talking about this with General McChrystal and others as well. The problem is you need good intelligence networks. And what Vice President Biden's plan, in my judgment, is challenged by is how do you preserve those intelligence networks when you've essentially vacated the area? So if you're going to pull back from the South, and here, by the way, I'm not speaking for McChrystal or Petraeus or anyone else, but I'm just trying to say I've tried to understand the nature of the activity of doing counterterrorism by speaking to these experts and then drawn my own conclusions about the Biden proposal along with my colleague Rydell. And what I think is that the allure of doing this forgets that if you pull back to Kabul and points north and west, a lot of our informants, a lot of our cooperative Afghans are going to be killed off as the Taliban move back into that space. And the ability to do counterterrorism from drones or from long-range raids is not going to be very effective. In fact, it's really back to the future or back to the past, because that's what we did for 5 years. That's what Rumsfeld tried to do. He tried to do long-range counterterrorism. That was the philosophy we used for the first 5 years in Afghanistan. And look what happened. The Taliban recovered. And they were able to intimidate the local population because they were walking the streets, and we were just coming in for a quick raid. And quite often, as Sarah Chase and others have documented in their writings, quite often we would get played off against, or by one Afghan tribe against another. And because we didn't have people on the ground, we didn't develop intelligence, we would come into an area, we'd walk around, we'd talk, and we'd say, where are the Taliban? And if you asked me, if you're a special forces guy for the US, you ask me where the Taliban are, I'm going to think, hey, there's my rival over there. That's my rival tribesman. He's Taliban. Go get him. We got played a lot in those early years because we had no idea what was going on the ground. Now in Pakistan, the reason we can be effective with these drones is partly because we do have human intelligence networks pretty close by to the Waziristans and the other FATA regions. The Pakistanis help us some, and we also have been there for a very long time, and the amount of space is relatively limited. Whereas if we were going to do the Biden plan, I think we would lose virtually all of the south and east of Afghanistan to the Taliban, and that becomes a huge ungoverned space in which I don't think we can be very effective at counterterrorism. So I think the Taliban and other extremists move back into that space with relative impunity. Al-Qaeda probably hides amidst the population. It's not going to create another Tarnak Farms, but it is going to intersperse itself with the urban population of Kandahar the same way that Hamas and Hezbollah do in the Middle East, and we're not going to be able to find them. So that's my concern. That's why I do not support the Biden plan. Yes, sir, in the back, and then I'll come back.
Being on a side note, a little concerning that the phraseology that you're using, you're going from counterinsurgency counterterrorism, you're almost using the words interchangeably.
No, I'm not. I'm responding. I'm responding to the Biden plan,
Okay.
which is different. The Biden plan is counterterrorism. The current strategy is rooted in counterinsurgency. Now, counterinsurgency does do counterterrorism as part of. But go ahead.
Yeah, and stability ops and everything else.
Right.
Now, I'm a proponent of tribal engagement, and it seems like your data is skewed towards Kandahar and Kabul. But once you hit the city limits, the central government really, from what I've seen, isn't really relevant past the city limits, and that's where the basically provincial government and tribal structure then sort of takes over. Did your methodology bring that into account? It sounds like your data is very urban, and I mean that's just 2 dots on a very large map that's separated by what? Some of the worst terrain on earth.
Well, first of all, I wish Kandahar City was as nice as Kabul. So even if I were urban-centric, I wouldn't claim Kandahar is yet any oasis of stability, and I'm sure you would agree with that. Secondly, I don't mean to say all my data comes from urban regions, but you're still right. I think you're still onto something to underscore the distinction between the urban areas and the rural areas in Afghanistan. And that's part of why I would say I'm a strong supporter of this new Afghan local police program that is an effort to try to essentially create, the Sons of Iraq equivalent for Afghanistan. And you probably know a lot about this. It sounds like you're pretty familiar with it, maybe even had been involved in it for all I know. But we're trying to work with the tribes to try to say, listen, we'll help you protect your own neighborhood as long as you follow certain rules. No large caliber weapons. Don't go on offensive operations. Allow yourselves to be put under some monitoring by the Afghan Ministry of Interior, accept some limited training from them, et cetera, and try to make this a multi-tribal structure, even though it's local, try to be inclusive. And that's the kind of philosophy that's behind it. As you know, I think one of the big determinants of whether or not we succeed is how well that program will work. Because I agree with you, it's not just building the Army and police, it's also doing these more tribal engagements. So I accept that point. Also, I think the National Solidarity Program is very important, and it accomplishes, I think, some of what you're trying to talk about as well, in the sense that, as you know, and again, it sounds like you're very familiar with Afghanistan, but for the benefit of others, the National Solidarity Program, which was an idea of former Finance Minister Ashraf Ghani, was to essentially have Kabul give cash grants to localities that could organize themselves, have a shura, have a discussion about what their top priorities were, and if they want a road for their village, then they appeal to Kabul through a certain official process, and Kabul just gives them a cash grant. And they go off and then do the contracting themselves to get the road built or what have you. Now, yes, there's a possibility of corruption, but frankly, the possibilities here are probably less worrisome at the tribal level than with a lot of the big actors in the cities that you and I are both worried about, I'm sure. And so the National Solidarity Program is another part of the strategy that tries to reach straight to the village. And so anyway, appreciate your point. I don't claim that the 2 things that I've cited answer all of your concerns, but I think they suggest that the strategy is trying to do some of these things. And again, we could have a fuller conversation about it, but those are some of the reasons I have some hope. Yes, here, and maybe both of you at the same time, and then I'll try to respond. You first, please.
Whose side are the Pakis on, and how does that affect our prospects there, or anyone's prospects?
Good question. And you want to add a thought, and then I'll try to answer them
Yeah.
both.
How do we play the fact that Karzai has no reluctance to use the Iran card to kind of tie our hands when it comes to making improvements in the democracy there?
Good. Iran and Pakistan, so they are naturally parallel sister questions. I'm a lot more worried about Pakistan. So let me begin. I'm glad you asked the question, and I'm glad it was in tandem with the one about Pakistan. The fact that Iran gave somebody in Karzai's government $1 million in a bag full of cash, big deal. We do that all the time. We've been doing that in Afghanistan since we started. And in fact, I'm just glad we know who in Karzai's government's getting the cash. Now, it is useful to know that because we do want to know who's more Iran-friendly than somebody else. But Iran's role in this conflict, as much as I do not trust or have anything nice to say about the Iranian regime in any way, shape, or form, their role in Afghanistan I would describe as somewhere between secondary and even relatively benign. Now, that may not stay that way forever, But the weapons they shipped into Iraq during the Iraq War, they're not sending those same kinds of weapons into Afghanistan. We're not seeing the explosively formed penetrators in any kind of number, for example, the very specialized kind of roadside bomb that they killed so many American troops with in Iraq. We don't see that. They don't have a great position to play off the Pashtun tribes against each other or against Karzai, because that's not their major area of influence. They're more influential with some of the northern tribes, who are basically, to put it bluntly, relatively speaking, the good guys in this fight. The insurgents are virtually all Pashtun. And I'm not saying Pashtun are bad, but I am saying that almost all bad guys are Pashtun, to paraphrase the old adage. And the Iranians are not that influential with the Pashtuns. The Pakistanis are the problem. The Pakistanis, I think, are very complex to understand, with apologies to any who may be in the room and any who may have, and I've got a lot of Pakistani friends, and I went to Pakistan at the invitation of the ISI last March and spent a bunch of time with them. But, and I understand their strategic dilemmas, but nonetheless, they are a problem. I think there's one part of the Pakistani mindset that's partially understandable and another part that's totally regrettable, but we're going to have to live with it for a while and just chip away at it. The latter is their obsession with India and their view that anything that India does is by definition bad, including building health clinics in Afghanistan, because they must be secret Indian intelligence arms, and maybe sometimes they even are, but who cares if they're passing out penicillin? I'm not that worried about them. The Pakistanis view, for the Pakistanis, complete failure of this current mission in Afghanistan would be bad. But what would really be bad is an India-friendly government in Afghanistan. And they will make sure that doesn't happen. They will do everything in their power. So that leads me to my second point. What we have within our control, what President Obama has within his control, is to make the Pakistanis more reassured that we are going to stay long enough to create some level of stability. Because I think the Pakistanis would benefit from a stable, multi-ethnic government in Afghanistan much more than they would benefit from chaos, even if the chaos led to their own friends being in office or in power in the South. But they don't know what we're doing yet. They're not convinced we're staying. They heard President Obama say the downsizing is going to begin in July, and they interpreted that to mean a rapid departure because they've seen this movie before. That's what we Americans usually do in Afghanistan or Pakistan. We achieve our immediate objective, and then we run for the hills. That's what we did in '89, and that's what they think we'll do again. And so their interpretation of history is the Americans are not dependable, and if Obama's already admitting that he wants to leave starting in July, that just reinforces the point even more. So I think President Obama's got to find language to suggest that even if he considers the strategy not to be working very well, his backup plan will not be Vice President Biden's, which I think is actually a big problem in this regard. I think it makes the Pakistanis paranoid. Vice President Biden's plan, in my judgment, sets up a civil war, a proxy war between India and Pakistan in Afghanistan, because it essentially concedes the South to the Pakistani influence and then allows a Northern Alliance-dominated rump north to be the residual Afghanistan, which the Indians will have a lot of influence in. So it's exactly the wrong competition that you want. What you should do, I think, if the current strategy fails, what you should do is go to a more modest variation on current strategy, which would essentially link our drawdown to the buildup of the Afghan army. So we don't have to stabilize the whole country before we leave, but we have to keep building up the army long enough that they have a shot at doing it themselves. That should reassure some Pakistanis. I'm sorry for the very long-winded answer. As you know, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of the complexities of Pakistani thinking. I would say Pakistan is, in a sense, one of the most complex allies we have ever had in any war in our history. I mean, dealing with Stalin was simple by comparison. I'm not saying that Pakistanis are like Stalin. I like him. But Stalin knew who he wanted to win in World War II. The Pakistanis haven't really figured out who they want to win in this war. And so they're almost playing both sides of the street. And we've got to think of every possible way to gradually move them more towards our side. There has been some positive movement, but there's a long ways to go. Yes, sir.
It's a shame that Iran, which could be our natural ally, I mean, they fought against the Taliban with the Northern Alliance in the '90s, and they're mortal enemies with the Taliban, with the extremist Sunnis, being a Shia country. And it's just tragic that we can't utilize Iran to help us defeat the Taliban. Do you have any comment on that?
I basically agree. Whether Iran would be able to do a lot to help or want to do a lot to help, I don't know. But I don't really see the downside in trying to have a limited dialogue with the Iranians on this. I think they're extraordinarily duplicitous as negotiators on the issues that concern their nuclear program and the Middle East. But I think that we did see some fledgling signs of early cooperation on Afghanistan after the overthrow of the Taliban in '01. And yeah, I would be willing to try that again. My expectations would not be high, but I don't see any reason not to try it.
I witnessed Vietnam very closely. I was old enough to know much about what went on and the environment that we were in from the early 60s through the 70s. You close to the military establishment. Tell us how they managed to keep a war out of an election as important as we just had last week, completely absent. How did they manage that?
I think the American people managed it. I think we had what 870. We had more than 870 candidates for Congress. We had more than 900, probably well into the 1,000+ range. We had 70-some people running for the Senate. They all had the opportunity to bring up this war, and almost none of them did. And they certainly had competitive reasons to bring it up if they thought it would help them. So I think what you're seeing is you're seeing a moment in this war, and I think it's a moment. I don't think it's permanent. But I think it's a moment where the American people are sick of the war, preoccupied by other more immediate problems, and also aware that we have to be a little bit patient to see if Petraeus can do it again. And until he's had a little more time, it's premature to sort of force a decision. And I think the American people, I've always felt the American people have excellent street smarts about war. Maybe not in Vietnam, I don't know. I didn't watch that debate as well. I was growing up in that period. But in my whole adult lifetime, I tend to think that the American voter has a pretty good sense of which wars are winnable, which ones, how long it takes to win them. I thought the debate about the Iraq surge was extremely sophisticated in our country, frankly. I mean, it got angry, it got polemical, it got partisan, and all that was understandable because a lot of people were dying. But it was also sophisticated in the sense that we sort of waited long enough to see if the surge was working. And I think we ultimately showed enough patience to give it a chance. So my overall take on, and even though people were dubious, as they should have been, so I'm not trying to take a side in this debate, but I think the collective national outcome was one that showed a lot of patience and a lot of street smarts. And I think the same American people are showing appropriate amount of patience. 9 years into this war, they were willing to have one election that didn't really turn on the war because they realized it was actually not a moment when you could judge whether or not the Petraeus-McChrystal strategy was working. However, that will change next year. And at that point, I expect the return of this war to the national political debate. Sir.
Could you address the role of Russia and its strategy for Afghanistan, given its history as the Soviet Union and the invasion of Afghanistan, what they're currently wanting to do themselves or not do?
Yeah, I think Russia's number one concern. I mean, there was probably a time in the mid part of the Bush administration when, frankly, at that time, Russia, so interested in checking American power, was glad to see us get our nose bloodied in Afghanistan, almost the same way that many people were glad to see us have troubles in Iraq. And it was almost partly, schadenfreude, frankly. And it wasn't a very sophisticated geostrategic analysis. As the years have gone by, and I'm not sure it's all about Obama winning the White House, I think it's partly just the passage of time. I think the Russians have become a little bit less obsessed with just seeing the Americans taken down a peg. And they also are losing thousands of people a year to heroin overdoses from poppy that originally came from Afghanistan. So their number one immediate concern is the drug problem, much more so than it is for us in terms of where our drug problem comes from. And you may have even noticed a couple weeks ago the Russians did a raid with us in northern Afghanistan against a drug lab, which Karzai did not appreciate because he didn't like seeing these Russians back in town, even up in Mazar-e-Sharif, where I think the raid occurred. But I think that the overall Russian interest now is helpful, and we're shipping a lot of supplies through the north into Afghanistan. Some of them transiting Russian territory, some of them not, but most of them benefiting from at least a Russian willingness to tolerate this. Because you recall a couple of years ago with the base in Kyrgyzstan and similar facilities in Tajikistan, the Russians were sort of competing with us for influence, hoping we might lose the facility. I think they've come to an awareness that if they want this campaign to be successful, and therefore for their heroin problem perhaps to be alleviated, they're better off helping us. And they also seem to be a little bit more hopeful about the U.S.-Russia relationship these days. That may contribute as well. So I don't want to sing the praises too much of Putin or even Medvedev, but I do think that there's more of a convergence of interests, which frankly was always there, but other things got in the way. And now the Russians realize this really is make or break time. And do they really want, the Americans to withdraw, leaving Afghanistan in chaos? Is that really in their interest? So I think they're staring that possibility in the face, realizing it's probably not in their interest. Yes, sir.
What does NATO disengagement look like? What's the process, and how long does it take?
Yeah, I think NATO is going to downsize more or less collectively at the pace we do, but of course that's going to vary from country to country. And as you know, undoubtedly, the Dutch have already left. That was a real blow because they were doing quite a bit in the south. The Canadians are probably on their way out. So that's 2 hits against our coalition because, as you know, there are only about 8 countries that have really been doing a lot of fighting in the south and the east, and I just mentioned 2 of them. But the British have shown great resolve. And, people say, well, the British Prime Minister just promised that they'd be out of Afghanistan by 2015. That's 5 years away. So if that's what he has to say to keep British domestic opinion in check, to me the story is how resolute the British people still are in the face of a very difficult campaign where they've been losing a lot of people, and they've been in Helmand province, which has been horrible, as you know. The French are still helping in the east. The Poles are still helping, the Australians. We do still have the Danes. We do still have the makings of a decent coalition in the east. I have been struck and stunned by how much the Germans have stayed on in this. Now, admittedly, they're up in the north. It's not quite as tough. But the Germans have lost 40 people in this war. And to think that with all of its history and all of its pacifism that resulted from what happened in World War II, to see the German polity willing to tolerate 40 deaths and still keep 4,000 plus troops in Afghanistan, to me is something. The Scandinavians are there. And again, they're in a relatively safer part of the country. But who would have thought that the peace-loving Scandinavians would stick this war out for 9 years? But they have. The Italians are still out in the West, and they lose people also. They've lost more than 30. So I see a coalition glass that's at least half full. Now, I admit it's a work in progress, and at any given day, it could go south in a hurry. And I really wish the Canadians were not leaving. And so there are a lot of negative things to say as well about the strength of the coalition. But on balance, 9 years into a war that we've basically been losing for 9 years, to think that 45 nations are still part of this coalition is pretty impressive, and we shouldn't lose sight of that positive side either. Yes, sir.
I was fortunate, I guess, to be in Afghanistan and northern Pakistan in the early 70s when the king was still there, and in fact he was overthrown, I guess, in 73. But the government seemed to be only effective in the cities, which many people have said. Very light footprint in the rural areas, but they seem to be satisfied with that. And I'm wondering, we seem to be trying to, we kind of look at things from our prism, and we seem to be thinking that what we're trying to create over there is maybe something they don't want. And the Taliban it's kind of portrayed as a them and us type thing. In a lot of cases, the Taliban are actually resident in those areas, so they're kind of their own, members of tribes. So Are we kind of on a fool's errand, I guess? As long as we're there, we're okay. Once we leave, you have Afghan security forces that in some cases are not from that area. They're not trusted either. So is this going to be another South Korea, or what are your thoughts about that?
It won't be as good as South Korea. I feel confident saying that. And I know this is not unlike some of the thinking and questioning from earlier. I would simply say I agree that historically Afghanistan has not had a strong government presence in the rural areas, but it has had a system of essentially patronage. And there has been a bit of a transactional relationship between even the rural areas and the central government, which is to some extent what we're now trying to mimic with these two programs that I discussed before. And so I think if you give local people a certain amount of access to the resources of the state, if you work with some of the local tribes on security locally, help them protect their own communities, and then probably if you think about giving them more choice in their leadership. So I think the Constitution in Afghanistan right now gives Karzai too much power to fire and replace local governors, and that's probably not smart for the reasons that you're getting at. Then I think we're not too far off from where we need to be, but what we also need to fix is a system where our presence pumps a lot of money into the hands of certain tribes, but not into the hands of others. And as long as we keep that problem unfixed, I think we're in bad trouble. Thankfully, Petraeus has one of the best one-stars in the Army, H.R. McMaster, on this job. I think they're making a lot of progress. It's too bad that it took 9 years to figure this out, but I'm hoping it's not too late. I guess we just have time for one more? Okay. Yes, sir. Here in the front. Actually, I'll take two and just give one answer.
Well, I'm probably not the only person in the room who just finished reading Woodward's book on this conflict and decision-making process. From the interviews Woodward does, I don't get the impression, as you do, that Biden's plan is a toss-away. It seems that there's more credence given to it, but that's reasonable. People will differ. Could you explain your opinion on the book?
Yeah. Okay. Sure. And then here, and then we'll wrap.
During my first deployment to Afghanistan in 2007, I got the opportunity to meet with a suicide bomber. And like all suicide bombers, they're from Pakistan. And this guy was funneled through the religious madrasas there in Pakistan. And just how do we stop this huge flow of Islamic extremists coming in from Pakistan with having additional troops in Afghanistan?
Yeah, okay. Let me try to wrap quickly. First of all, on that issue, and thank you for your service, and I'm glad to see your home. And I think that, again, the working the Pakistan problem is a huge dilemma. I think that we made a little headway, partly because the Pakistanis are now more scared than they used to be, because they see their own homegrown Taliban attacking their country. And to some extent, they want to believe that they can separate out the different extremists from each other, and they can still support the Afghan Taliban, but not have it come back to haunt them with a stronger Pakistani Taliban. And I think some smart people in Pakistan realize that's not realistic, that there actually is a lot of collaboration across these groups. And as time goes by, more people are figuring that out. So to some extent, time is our ally. Time is also potentially our ally if we now approach July 2011 and we don't leave fast. And the Pakistanis realize the Americans are not going to desert this area like they have before. I would also personally consider some greater incentives for the Pakistanis, but also a little bit of a carrot and stick. And what I would say to them is, if you help us win the war, and what I mean by this is, if we win the war, that's the way we know that you helped us win. If we do win, then all things are possible, including the civilian nuclear power deal that you want. If we don't win the war, while we can never desert you entirely because you're a nuclear-armed state, we don't have to give you $4 billion or $3.5 billion a year like we're doing now. And we don't have to sort of try to keep our relations with you and India on a more or less even par. There are nuances or degrees of support between what we're doing now, what we could do in the future, and what we would do if this war blatantly failed and you were seen as part of the reason. So I would, these are the kind of conversations we're having with the Pakistanis all the time, I think. But I think we've got to push it. I proposed this idea in an op-ed last week that we actually specifically say to the Pakistanis, we will give you a civilian nuclear deal if we win the war. And it's just that simple. So we're not, you know, we don't care about whether you arrest 2 guys today and then release them tomorrow, you know, because we know how you play that game. We don't care if you clamp down on this one little sub-district of North Waziristan, but tell the people in advance you're coming so they can relocate somewhere else, because we've seen you do that too. The metric of whether you're cooperating or not is whether we win the war in Afghanistan. Because if you help us the way you should, we will win. The insurgents can't win this without a sanctuary. So I would try to be a little bit more, you know, big picture in talking to the Pakistanis and try to focus their mind on their choices. As for the Woodward book, I know Vice President Biden wants to hope that his plan would reduce the degree of extremists in southern Afghanistan, and he wants to hold on to airfields at Bagram and Kandahar and elsewhere, and perhaps even a few other facilities. But I just, you know, I can't get away from the notion that if you concede Kandahar City and the populated areas of the Helmand River Valley and other major areas and arteries in the south to the extremists, that your human intelligence goes away. You just can't protect your sources. And you have this huge lawless area that I think becomes a haven for first the Taliban, then the extremist groups they will bring in. And then the Taliban aren't going to be content with Kandahar. They're going to then say, okay, Kabul is now the prize. That's what they wanted last time, and they got it. And so the looming civil war between the Tajiks and the Pashtun then becomes more likely, and the proxy war between India and Pakistan. I like Vice President Biden. I even had the chance to briefly discuss this issue with him once in private. And so the conversation was mostly about Iraq, where he is extraordinarily knowledgeable. But I just disagree with his assessment of how this would play out in regard to Afghanistan, where I don't think he's as convincing. So that's all I can say. The Woodward book I found disappointing. Woodward is an amazing journalist, and his books always are sort of, you know, what you see is what you get. You know, they're a recounting of ongoing dialogue. But I've seen him on TV as well since the book was published. And with all due respect, I think he sort of missed some of the same story that he told. Because he, for example, one of his big griefs and beefs has been Obama never got a full range of options from the Pentagon. Come on, Obama got what he wanted. Obama had already campaigned for president on this being his top national security priority. He had already done one review in 2009 in the winter after being inaugurated that Bruce Rydell, my same colleague, coordinated for him on how to handle policy towards Afghanistan, and he decided then and there that he wanted to beef up our presence. And Woodward seems offended that somehow Obama did not revisit that decision and go to a more minimalist option. And by the way, he had every ability to do so at any given point, because he's the president, and he could have said to the Pentagon, I want a new strategy that will be a counterterrorism strategy. But you know what happened? And it's in Woodward's book. Whenever Biden tried to win this debate, Obama said, no, I don't agree with you. And Obama did, he got all those phone calls and faxes from Vice President Biden over Thanksgiving weekend last year. And Biden wanted to come in and see him again. And Obama said, no, I've made up my mind. I appreciate your viewpoint. I respect your thoughtfulness. Maybe someday I'll rethink your option, but right now I have no interest in it. And the Pentagon is developing for me the options that I want, all of which are based on some level of intensified effort to try to stabilize more of the country, because we already tried the light footprint and it didn't work. That's what I campaigned against when I said that Bush and Rumsfeld got it wrong. Somehow Woodward seems to have missed these parts of the story and been so caught up in sort of recounting the day-by-day conversation, as well as the scandals of who hated who at what moment, that he missed the analytical part of the story. So I'm not a big fan of the book. I read it page for page thoroughly. I read a lot of Woodward's other books. I think this was the worst one he's written, because I think it missed the big picture more than his other ones have. That's my take. Sorry to finish on a negative note, going after the god of American journalism, but maybe can we finish on one last one as just to round it off on a more positive vibe?
Easy question. When we entered Afghanistan, did we have a clear-cut mission and objective, or were these attributes moving, evolving targets over time?
Well, we've changed. We did go in to try to go after al-Qaeda, no doubt, and that's probably what you're getting at. And we thought And again, in fairness to Rumsfeld, and in fairness to Biden, and maybe even in fairness to Woodward, if I really try to feel generous, the initial goal was accomplished to a large extent. And then, lo and behold, 5 years later, the people we thought we had resoundingly and definitively defeated are making a comeback because the initial strategy didn't work. And so to come back to your earlier point, sir, and this is a good way to finish, to do counterterrorism, which was our ultimate strategic goal, we discovered that we also had to do counterinsurgency. Because if you just try to do the counterterrorism by long-range strikes, you fail. Your information networks, your intelligence networks are not adequate. The Taliban sense weakness and move back in, and all of a sudden you've got the threat of another Taliban sanctuary back in Afghanistan. So yes, we had to, even if the ultimate goal was still to prevent future al-Qaeda attacks on the homeland here, and you could argue that that goal has always been the overarching, fundamental motivation. The operational objectives to accomplish that did change because the original approach didn't succeed.
Yeah, but don't you think that from a resource point of view, we got ourselves involved in a 10-year war. I mean, the objective, yes, go in there, teach a lesson that, hey, you do something really bad to us, and there's severe consequences. Wouldn't that lesson have been sufficient?
And I know I'm already overdue, so I'm just going to, here's the way I'm going to answer the question, because we should continue to have that broader historical and strategic debate. But right now we're at a moment in late 2010 where we've made certain choices. We are where we are. And the debate I'm most interested in right now is the 2011 debate. And I'll just say this, I have enough sympathy for your concerns that I do think 2011 is sort of put up or shut up time for our efforts with this strategy. And if this strategy cannot show that it's working, then we do need to fall back, not on Biden's plan, I don't think, because I think that would be too problematic, but on this idea of downsizing our forces as the Afghan army stands up, even if we cannot stabilize as much of the country as we would have liked to in the meantime. And I'll leave it at that.
I'm sorry. Thank you all for coming and for your great questions. I hope you have a good evening. I hope we see you next week on the 18th, which is Thursday, for our next talk. Have a great evening.